Welcome to Books of the Book. We're studying the letters of Paul to the Thessalonians. I'm John Pauline, Dean of the School of Religion at Loma Linda University, and with me is my pastor, John Ciccarelli, pastor of the Calamasa Seventh-day Adventist Church. What will we be looking at today, John?
Well, John, we're going to start picking it up in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 1 through 12. And here Paul is talking about his time with them and his intents behind the things that he did when he was with them. Why don't you take us there?
Well, in chapter 1, he's focusing on the church. So in all of that, he's talking about them, he's praying for them, he's thankful for them, he's reciting all the things that they're doing. But in this passage, he switches from the church to the apostles. And what's really special, I think, about this passage is it gives us a window into Paul's inner emotions and motivations and so forth. This is pretty rare, actually, in the New Testament or even in the Scriptures as a whole. Psalms would be an example, I think, in the Old Testament where you have a lot of introspection and a look inside of an inspired writer. Right. But this is one of the clearest places for Paul, and it's pretty exciting. And Paul's talking about motivations for ministry. Why would one want to go into ministry? Why would one want to be a missionary? Why would one want to be an evangelist? And what are the things that lie behind this? And he goes through a whole list of the kinds of motivations that people had in the ancient world for doing similar type of work. Rules them all out. And he says, really, there's only two. He says, I'm motivated by what God thinks, and I'm motivated by my love for you guys. Wow. And so we'll get into that in a little more detail here. Why don't you read the first couple verses of the chapter?
Sure. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our access with you was not empty. On the contrary, having suffered beforehand and having been severely mistreated in Philippi, as you know, we began to be bold through our God to speak to you the gospel of God in the context of much inner struggle." You know, this brings us back to that time when he was in Philippi before he came to Thessalonica, and they were beaten. You know, they were beaten and they were thrown into prison. I mean, they really had it tough. They came to Thessalonica beat up and bruised.
What was it like in the prison? I mean, how did they confine them?
Oh, you know, they wanted them in the deepest part, the inner part of the prison, and put their feet in stocks and locked them up. You know.
So they were confined, chained up, like
Right.
they could hardly even move.
Right, and then thank God at midnight as they're singing hymns and praying prayers, God sends an earthquake, you know, to let them out, and then of course the jailer gets saved, as we read later in the story.
So here in the first couple verses of 1 Thessalonians 2, they're referring back to that experience. When they entered Thessalonica, they had visible signs of those beatings. There were bruises, there were probably cuts, they were really pretty beat up. And I think the important thing, the reason he brings it up here, is to say, a lot of people come into town here. A lot of people say stuff. A lot of people teach stuff. And for a lot of people, it's not real. It's a way to earn an easy living. But he says, for us, it's real. If it wasn't real, we wouldn't have brought the gospel to you. You see, because they were all beat up by any human kind of condition. They should have quit preaching. If this was phony, we wouldn't even have come. So it was very, very clear that the message was genuine, that they truly, honestly believed it deep inside. And Paul also wants to make the point, God was with us. We became bold. You know, there's a sense that God took over. In spite of all these things, God took over. And this word inner struggle, that's a translation a little bit different than what you'll see in most Bible translations. It's in the Greek, it's the word agony. It's where we get agony from in the English. It's actually a Greek-based word. And even in the English, agony can be physical, but it can also be emotional.
Sure.
Now, in the Greek, that term was particularly used for athletics. The Olympians, as they're striving, to reach the marker and win the race, it's the agony, the agony of defeat, the agony and the ecstasy, and so on. But in the New Testament, that word is consistently used for a more inner struggle. There are words for persecution. There are words for getting beat up and mistreated, and you see some of those in this verse. But this particular word is about inner struggle. Paul is opening up the inside and saying, we're apostles, we struggle too. We have our challenges. We're not always sure what God is doing in this situation or how we should relate to other people. So another thing they mention in this text is access. The Thessalonians had something to do with this too. They were open. They were accessible. They were free. They were hungry for this thing. So as Paul experiences the Thessalonian desire for the message, as he experiences God's power and working, they pick up emotionally from these wounds and get after it again.
I like, John, one of the things I like that you said is that how they became bold. Sometimes I think we accept Christ, go be bold. And if we're not bold all the time, we sometimes feel guilty or like we're not doing what we should. But I like how you brought out he became bold. And the boldness came, I think, as he experienced God, Christ in his life through the sufferings. And the Spirit continued to make him bold. And I think about, suffering and how much, almost probably all of our prayers from the day we're children, protect us from suffering. And yet suffering seems to be such a means, if you will, of us letting go and letting God do more in our life. And again, I mentioned once before from Hebrews 5, where it talks about Jesus, even though he was a son, he learned obedience through suffering. And I think in my own life and those that I've counseled with, suffering seems to be, if we look at our life like a vessel, suffering seems to be one of those things that begins to break the vessel so that it can expand and it can grow. And there's, in a sense, not to belittle, but in a sense, there's more room for God's grace in our life, that we can grow and the vessel can expand. And yet those wounds that God brings healing to also act as a way for God's grace to kind of ooze through the cracks, if you will, as we're with people. And you've probably experienced that, and I have, when you're with people who are suffering. If you have suffered, you understand a little bit more. You're more gracious, you're more gentle. You're not there to stand and rebuke. You should be trusting God more, different things, but to be with them in the suffering and let God minister them through you. So suffering is a huge thing for us to grow as Christians and to continue to let loose of the reins of our lives and trust God, in the things of our lives. And so I like how you said he became more bold, And those sufferings, I think, were a key part of that.
Even the apostles were in this process of growing and becoming more like Jesus. Let's go on to verse 3, and I should mention to our viewing audience that the translations of 1 Thessalonians are my own, and the reason is not in any disrespect for other Bible translations, but sometimes the grammar of the original language, sometimes there's key words that are repeated, and in translation, some of that is lost. And so by using these translations, we have the opportunity to catch some of the flavor of the original language and bring that out to you. Verse 3, I want to particularly focus on 3 words there. He says, our appeal to you does not arise out of delusion or out of uncleanness or to deceive. Now, it's very interesting. In the ancient world, there was a philosopher named Aristotle, and I think most people have heard of Aristotle. And Aristotle was a pagan, but the encouraging thing, perhaps, is from his teacher, he did learn monotheism. He did have one God. So for the pagans, that was a major advance. But Aristotle was a keen observer of people. And he suggested, he wrote a book called The Art of Persuasion. In ancient Greek, this is like 2,300 years old, The Art of Persuasion. Preaching books are still based on that. He was so observant of how people are persuaded of things. See? And he said there's 3 things that persuade people. Number 1 is the character of the speaker, the credibility of the speaker.
That's important.
And he calls that the ethos in Greek, who come ethical from that. Second is the logic of the argument. The Greek word is logos, so we get logic from that. It's got to be a logical argument. It's got to make sense. And then third is emotion, passion, that you have to connect with the emotions of the hearer. In this particular passage, Paul is talking about the first of those three, the character of the apostles. The apostles' character was one of the things that drove the whole message. And so it was very, very important. And Paul is saying here, look, it's not out of delusion. Delusion is, and it's translated different ways in different versions, but the Greek word here implies that someone genuinely believes something, but they're just nuts.
Yeah.
They just don't know. They're really excited about this, and it's totally off the wall. You see, there are folk like that. Paul says, no, we're not delusional here.
Yeah.
We're dealing with real stuff. Second, he says we are not out of uncleanness. And that's a Greek word that really talks about sexual uncleanness. So Paul's saying, I was not motivated sexually by this. And that's something maybe we want to explore a little later.
Right.
Would anybody find ministry a path to sexual uncleanness? Is there something going on there? We've known sometimes of famous pastors who have struggled in that area. A third thing he says, it's not to deceive. A deceiver is somebody who knows what he's saying is false and is deliberately trying to twist you and so on. So Paul's saying, I did not come out of intellectual mistake. I did not come for sexual opportunity. I did not come to be deceptive. If I'd have been motivated by these things, we'd have quit a long time ago.
Yeah.
So,
I like how you brought out the character that Paul's really bringing out here, in his message. And that is just so essential when we're sharing the gospel, living the gospel, really. And, as a pastor, I know in my own experience, I can get up and I can talk, give a great sermon or a bad sermon, somewhere on the scale, but living with the people and they get to know who you are, 80% of that sermon is spoken before you even get up there because of who you are with them.
Who you are.
And if you're living what you're talking about, it impacts it so much more. If you're not living with the people and you give these wonderful sermons, that rank high on the scales, but maybe you're not living it with them, that sermon has no power. And so, people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. And that's an old saying that I think has a lot of weight. And I think the way that we can actually live that life is that simple message that Jesus gave in John 15 about abiding in him. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. And so we just abide in him, we trust in him, it leads to loving one another. And then he says, people will know that you'll bear witness of me because you've been with me. And so that being with Jesus will lead us to be authentic in our message and when we share the gospel.
Sounds awesome. Let me just read the next few verses because I think that picks up on where we're from. He says, on the contrary, all right, he's going to his real motivation here. Just as we've been tested or approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, just so we speak, not as pleasing people, but God who tests our hearts. So Paul says, I don't go to people for my guidelines. I don't go to people for my character. I go to God, and I let God test my heart. And so he was working from this perspective. The popular philosophers said, know thyself, examine thyself. But Paul is saying, no, he says, I let God examine me. And after the break, perhaps we want to reflect briefly on how you do that.